Chapter 4 of Station Amusements in New Zealand by Lady Mary Anne Barker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Chapter 4 Skating in the Back Country. I do not believe that even in Canada the skating can be better than that which was within our reach in the Malvern Hills. Among our sheltered valleys and sunny slopes, the hardest frost only lasted a few hours after dawn. But 25 miles farther back, on the border of the glacier region, the mountain tarns could boast of ice several feet thick all the winter. We heard rumors of far inland lakes, across which heavily laden bullock teams could pass in perfect safety for 3 months of the year, and we grumbled at the light film over our own large ponds, which would not bear even my little terrier's weight after midday. And yet it was cold enough at night, during our short bright winters, to satisfy the most icy-minded person. I think that I have mentioned before that the wooden houses in New Zealand, especially those roughly put together up country, are by no means weather-tight. Disagreeable as this may be, it is doubtless the reason of the extraordinary immunity from colds and coughs which we hill-dwellers enjoyed, living between walls formed by inch-boards overlapping each other, and which can only be made to resemble English rooms by being canvassed and papered inside. The pure fresh air finds its way in on all sides. A hot room in winter is an impossibility, in spite of drawn curtains and blazing fires. Therefore, the risk of sudden changes of temperature is avoided. Some such theory as this is absolutely necessary to account for the wonderfully good health enjoyed by all, in the most capricious and trying climate I have ever come across. When a strong nor'wester was howling down the glen, I have seen the pictures on my drawing-room walls blowing out to an angle of 45 degrees, although every door and window in the little low wooden structure had been closed for hours. It has happened to me more than once, on getting up in the morning, to find my clothes, which had been laid on a chair beneath my bedroom window overnight, completely covered by powdered snow, drifting in through the ill-fitting casement. This same window was within a couple feet of my bed, and between me and it was neither curtain nor shelter of any sort. Of a winter's evening, I have often been obliged to wrap myself up in a big Scotch maud, as I sat, dressed in a high linsey gown, by a blazing fire, so hard was the frost outside. But by 10 o'clock next morning I would be loitering about the veranda, basking in the sunshine, and watching the light flecks of cloud wreaths and veils floating across an Italian blue sky. Yet such is the inherent discontent of the human heart, that instead of rejoicing in this lovely midday sunshine, we actually mourned over the vanished ice, which at daylight had been found by a much-envied early riser, strong enough to slide on for half an hour. It seemed almost impossible to believe that anyone had been sliding that morning within a few feet of where I sat, working in a blaze of sunshine, with my pretty grey and pink Australian parrot pluming itself on the branch of a silver wattle close by, and Joey, the tiny monkey from Panama, sitting on the skirt of my gown, with a piece of its folds arranged by himself shawl-wise over his glossy black shoulders. If either of these tropical pets had been left out after 4 o'clock that sunny day, they would have been frozen to death before our supper time. It was just on such a day as this, and in just such a bright midday hour, that a distant neighbour of ours rode up to the garden gate leading a pack-horse. Outside the saddlebags, with which this animal was somewhat heavily laden, could be plainly seen a beautiful new pair of Oxford skates, glinting in the sunshine, and it must have been the sight of these beloved implements which called forth the half-envious remark from one of the gentlemen, "I suppose you have lots of skating up at your place?" "Well, not exactly at my station, but there is a capital lake 10 miles from my house, where I am sure of a good day's skating any time between June and August," answered Mr. C.H., our newly arrived guest. We all looked at each other. I believe I heaved a deep sigh, and dropped my thimble, which Joey instantly seized, and with a low chirrup of immense delight, commenced to poke down between the boards of the veranda. It was too bad of us to give such broad hints by looks, if not by words. Poor Mr. C.H. was a bachelor in those days. He had not been at his little out-of-the-way homestead for some weeks, and was ignorant of its resources in the way of firing, always an important matter at a station, or even of tea and mutton. He had no woman servant, and was totally unprepared for an incursion of skaters, and yet, New Zealand fashion, no sooner did he perceive that we were all longing and pining for some skating, that he invited us all most cordially to go up to his back country run the very next day with him and skate as long as we liked. This was indeed a delightful prospect, the more especially as it happened to be only Monday, which gave us plenty of time to be back again by Sunday for our weekly service. We made it a rule never to be away from home on that day, lest any of our distant congregation should ride their 20 miles or so across country and find us absent. When the host is willing and the guests eager, it does not take long to arrange a plan, so the next morning found 3 of us, besides Mr. C.H., mounted and ready to start directly after breakfast. I have often been asked how I managed in those days about toilette arrangements, when it was impossible to carry any luggage except a small swag, closely packed in a waterproof case and fastened on the same side as the saddle pocket. First of all, I must assure my lady readers that I prided myself on turning out as neat and natty as possible at the end of the journey, and yet I rode not only in my everyday linsey gown, which could be made long or short at pleasure, but in my crinoline. This was artfully looped up on the right side, and tied by ribbon, in such a way that when I came out ready dressed to mount, no one in the world could have guessed that I had on any cage beneath my short riding habit with a loose tweed jacket over the body of the dress. Within the swag was stowed a brush and comb, collar, cuffs, and handkerchiefs, a little necessary linen, a pair of shoes, and perhaps a ribbon for my hair, if I meant to be very smart. On this occasion we all found that our skates occupied a terribly large proportion, both of weight and space, in our modest kits, but still we were much too happy to grumble. Where could you find a gayer quartet than started at an easy canter up the valley that fresh bracing morning? From the very first our faces were turned to the southwest, and before us rose the magnificent chain of the Southern Alps, with their bold snowy peaks, standing out in a glorious dazzle against the cobalt sky. A stranger, or, colonially speaking, a new chum, would have thought we must needs cross that barrier range before we could penetrate any distance into the back country. But we knew of long winding valleys and gullies running up between the giant slopes, which would lead us, almost without our knowing how high we had climbed, up to the elevated but sheltered plateau among the back country ranges where Mr. C.H.'s homestead stood. There was only one steep saddle to be crossed, and that lay between us and Rockwood, 6 miles off. It was the worst part of the journey for the horses, so we had easy consciences in dismounting and waiting an hour when we reached that most charming and hospitable of houses. I had just time for one turn round the beautiful garden, where the flowers and shrubs of old England grew side by side with the wild and lovely blossoms of our New Island home, when the expected coo-ee rang out shrill and clear from the rose-covered porch. It was but little past midday when we made our second start, and set seriously to work over 15 miles of fairly good galloping ground. This distance brought us well up to the foot of a high range, and the last 6 miles of the journey had to be accomplished in single file and with great care and discretion, for the track led through bleak, desolate valleys, round the shoulder of abutting spurs, through swamps, and up and down rocky staircases. Mr. C.H. and his cob both knew the way well, however, and my bay mare, Helen, had the cleverest legs and the wisest as well as the prettiest head of her race. If left to herself, she seldom made a mistake, and the few tumbles she and I ever had together took place only when she found herself obliged to go my way instead of her own. We entered the gorges of the high mountains between us and the west, and soon lost sight of the sun. Even the brief winter twilight faded away more swiftly than usual amid those dark defiles, and it was pitch dark, though only 5 o'clock, when we heard a sudden and welcome clamour of dog voices. These deep-mouthed tones invariably constitute the first notes of a sheep station's welcome, and a delightful sound it is to the belated and bewildered traveller, for besides guiding his horse to the right spot, the noise serves to bring out someone to see who the traveller may be. On this occasion we heard one man say to the other, "It's the boss," so almost before we had time to dismount from our tired horses. Remember, they had each carried a heavy swag besides their riders. Lights gleamed from the windows of the little house, and a wood fire sparkled and sputtered on the open hearth. Mr. C.H. only just guided me to the door of the sitting-room, making an apology and injunction together. "It's very rough, I am afraid, but you can do what you like," before he hastened back to assist his guests in settling their horses comfortably for the night. Labour used to be so dear and wages so high, especially in the back country of New Zealand, that the couple of men, one for indoor work, to saw wood, milk, cook, sweep, wash, etc., and the other to act as gardener, groom, ploughman, and do all the numerous odd jobs around the place, 100 miles and more from the nearest shop, represented a wage expenditure of at least £200 a year. Every gentleman, therefore, as a matter of course, sees to his own horse when he arrives unexpectedly at a station, and I knew I should have at least half an hour to myself. The first thing to do was to let down my crinoline, for I could only walk like a crab in it when it was fastened up for riding, kilt up my linsey gown, take off my hat and jacket, and set to work. The curtains must be drawn close, and the chairs moved out from their symmetrical positions against the wall. Then I made an expedition into the kitchen, and won the heart of the stalwart cook, who was already frying chops over the fire, by saying in my best German, "I have come to help you with the tea." Poor man! It was very unfair, for Mr. C.H. had told me during our ride that his servitor was a German, and I had employed the last long hour of the journey in rubbing up my exceedingly rusty knowledge of that language, and arranging 1 or 2 effective sentences. Poor Karl's surprise and delight knew no bounds, and he burst forth into a long monologue, to which I could find no readier answers than smiles and nods, hiding my inability to follow up my brilliant beginning under the pretence of being very busy. By the time the gentlemen had stabled and fed the horses and were ready, Karl and I between us had arranged a bright, cosy little apartment with a capital tea dinner on the table. After this meal there were pipes and toddy, and as I could not retire, like Mrs. Micawber at David Copperfield's supper party, into the adjoining bedroom and sit myself in the cold, I made the best of the somewhat dense clouds of smoke with which I was soon surrounded, and listened to the fragmentary plans for the next day. Then we all separated for the night, and in 2 minutes I was fast asleep in a little room no bigger than the cabin of a ship, with an opossum rug on a sofa for my bed and bedding. It was cold enough the next morning, I assure you, so cold that it was difficult to believe the statement that all the gentlemen had been down at daybreak to bathe in the great lake, which spread like an inland sea before the bay window of the little sitting-room. This lake, the largest of the mountain chain, never freezes, on account partly of its great depth, and also because of its sunny aspect. Our destination lay far inland, and if we meant to have a good long day's skating, we must start at once. Such a perfect day as it was! I felt half inclined to beg off the first day on the ice, and to spend my morning wandering along the rata-fringed shore of Lake Coleridge, with its glorious enclosing of hills, which might fairly be called mountains. But I feared to seem capricious or lazy, when really my only difficulty was in selecting a pleasure. The sun had climbed well over the high barriers, which lay eastwards, and was shining brightly down through the quivering blue ether overhead. The frost sparkled on every broad flax blade or slender tussock spine, as if the silver side of the earth were turning outwards that winter morning. No sooner had we mounted, with no swag except our skates this time, than Mr. C.H. set spurs to his horse and bounded over the slip-rail of the paddock before Karl could get it down. We were too primitive for gates in those parts. They only belonged to the civilization nearer Christchurch, and I had much ado to prevent my pony from following his lead, especially as the other gentlemen were only too delighted to get rid of some of their high spirits by a jump. However, Karl got the top rail down for me, and Mouse hopped over the lower one gaily, overtaking the leader of the expedition in a very few strides. We could not keep up our rapid pace long, for the ground became terribly broken and cut up by swamps, quicksands, blind creeks, and all sorts of snares and pitfalls. Every moment added to the desolate grandeur of the scene. Bleak hills rose up on either hand, with still bleaker and higher peaks appearing beyond them again. An awful silence, unbroken by the familiar cheerful sound of the sheep calling to each other, for even the hardy merino cannot live in these ranges during the winter months, brooded around us, and the dark mass of a splendid bush, extended over many hundreds of acres, only added to the lonely grandeur of the scene. We rode almost the whole time in a deep cold shade, for between us and the warm sun rays were such lofty mountains that it was only for a few brief noontide moments he could peep over their steep sides. After 2 hours' riding, at the best pace which we could keep up through these terrible gorges, a sharp turn of the track brought us in full view of our destination. I can never forget that first glimpse of Lake Ida. In the cleft of a huge, gaunt, bare hill, divided as if by a giant hand, lay a large, black sheet of ice. No ray of sunshine ever struck it from autumn until spring, and it seemed impossible to imagine our venturing to skate merrily in such a sombre-looking spot. But New Zealand sheep farmers are not sentimental, I am afraid. Beyond a rapid thought of self-congratulation that such cold country was not on their run, they did not feel affected by its eternal silence and gloom. The ice would bear, and what more could skater's heart desire? At the end of the dark tarn, nearest to the track by which we had approached it, stood a neat little hut. And judge my amazement when, as we rode up to it, a young gentleman, looking as if he was just going out for a day's deer-stalking, opened the low door and came out to greet us. Yes, here was one of those strange anomalies peculiar to the colonies. A young man fresh from his university, of refined tastes and cultivated intellect, was leading here the life of a boor, without companionship or appreciation of any sort. His mate seemed to be a rough west countryman, honest and well-meaning enough, but utterly unsuited to Mr. K. It was the old story of wild, unpractical ideas hastily carried out. Mr. K. had arrived in New Zealand a couple of years before with all his worldly wealth, £1,000. Finding this would not go very far in the purchase of a good sheep run, and hearing some calculations about the profit to be derived from breeding cattle based upon somebody's lucky speculation, he eagerly caught at one of the many offers showered upon unfortunate new chums, and bought the worst and bleakest bit of one of the worst and bleakest runs in the province. The remainder of his money was laid out in purchasing stock, and now he had sat down patiently to wait in his little hut until such time as his brilliant expectations would be realized. I may say here they became fainter and fainter year by year, and at last faded away altogether, leaving him at the end of 3 lonely, dreadful years with exactly half his capital, but double his experience. However, this has nothing to do with my story, except that I can never think of our skating expedition to that lonely lake, far back among those terrible hills, without a thrill of compassion for the only living human being who dwelt among them. It was too cold to dawdle about, however, that day. The frost lay white and hard upon the ground, and we felt that we were cruel in leaving our poor horses standing to get chilled whilst we amused ourselves. Although my beloved Helen was not there, having been exchanged for the day in favour of Master Mouse, a shaggy pony, whose paces were as rough as its coat, I begged a red blanket for Mr. K, and covered up Helen's stable companion, whose sleek skin spoke of a milder temperature than that on Lake Ida's gloomy shore. Our simple arrangements were soon made. Mr. K left directions to his mate to prepare a repast consisting of tea, bread, and mutton for us, and each carrying our skates, we made the best of our way across the frozen tussocks to the lake. Mr. K proved an admirable guide over its surface, for he was in the habit during the winter of getting all his firewood out of the opposite bush and bringing it across the lake on sledges drawn by bullocks. We accused him of having cut up our ice dreadfully by these means, but he took us to a part of the vast expanse where an unbroken field of at least 10 acres of ice stretched smoothly before us. There were no boards marked "dangerous," nor any intimation of the depth of water beneath. The most timid person could feel no apprehension on ice which seemed more solid than the earth. So accordingly, in a few moments, we had buckled and strapped on our skates, and were skimming and gliding, and I must add, falling, in all directions. We were very much out of practice at first, except Mr. K, who skated every day, taking short cuts across the lake to track a stray heifer, or explore a blind gully. I despair of making my readers see the scene as I saw it, or of conveying any adequate idea of the intense, the appalling loneliness of the spot. It really seemed to me as if our voices and laughter, so far from breaking the deep eternal silence, only brought it out into stronger relief. On either hand rose up, sheer from the water's edge, a great barren shingly mountain. Before us loomed a dark pine forest whose black shadows crept up until they merged in the deep crevasses and fissures of the snowy range. Behind us stretched the winding gullies by which we had climbed to this mountain tarn, and Mr. K.'s little hut and a scrap of a garden and paddock gave the one touch of life, or possibility of life, to this desolate region. In spite of all scenic wet blankets, we tried hard to be gay, and no one but myself would acknowledge that we found the lonely grandeur of our rink too much for us. We skated away perseveringly until we were both tired and hungry, when we returned to Mr. K.'s hut, took a hasty meal, and mounted our chilled steeds. Mr. C.H. insisted on bringing poor Mr. K. back with us, though he was somewhat reluctant to come, alleging that a few days spent in the society of his kind made the solitude of his weather-board hut all the more dreary. The next day, and yet the next, we returned to our gloomy skating ground, and when I turned round in my saddle, as we rode away on Friday evening for a last look at Lake Ida, lying behind us in her winter-black numbness, her aspect seemed even more forbidding than ever, for only the bare, steep hillsides could be seen. Pine forest and the white distant mountains were all blotted and blurred out of sight by a heavy pall of cloud creeping slowly up. "Let us ride fast," cried Mr. K., "or we shall have a sou'wester upon us." So we galloped home as quickly as we could, over ground that I don't really believe I could summon courage to walk across ever so slowly today. But then one's nerves and courage are in a very different order out in New Zealand to the low standard which rules for ladies in England who, quote, "live at home in ease," end quote. Long before we reached home the storm was pelting us. My little jacket was like a white board when I took it off, for the sleet and snow had frozen as it fell. I was wet to the skin, and so numb with cold I could hardly stand when we reached home at last, in the dark and downpour. I could only get my things very imperfectly dried, and had to manage as best I could, but yet no one even thought of making the inquiry next morning when I came out to breakfast, "Have you caught cold?" It would have seemed a ridiculous question. End of chapter 4.